Throughout history, there have been innumerable massacres, large numbers of people killed for many reasons, and the U.S. has not been immune. Before, during, and especially after the Civil War, racial tensions rose to new heights, and most tensions reached a boiling point after former slaves were given new freedoms under the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery, the 14th Amendment, which granted freed blacks citizenship and civil rights, and the 15th Amendment, giving black men the right to vote. Formerly enslaved people were given these freedoms, citizenship, and the right to vote, but these new laws were considered detrimental social and lawful order by many whites. After the Civil War, the United States tried to rebuild during Reconstruction, and for a brief, fragile moment, America came close to fulfilling its founding ideals. But there were challenges and dangers for freed black Americans. What was the Colfax Massacre? When and where did it occur? What was the aftermath? How did this event affect the freed slaves long term? How is it remembered today? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. This is not just a story of violence, it's a story of betrayal, silence, and the slow suffocation of a promise called Reconstruction. In Grant Parish, Louisiana, a place carved out to be majority black, these rights weren't just theory, they were law. In the years following the U.S. Civil War, a number of freedmen and white candidates sympathetic to the cause of racial equality were elected to office across the South, creating tensions that would explode. This progress stirred up deep resentments among the other white Southerners, bitter over the loss of the Civil War and eager to once again enshrine white supremacy into law. It seemed that one person was trying to mend the emotional damage caused by the war. His name was James Madison Wells. In March 1865, James Madison Wells became governor. As the Democratic-nominated legislature passed the black codes restricting rights of freed slaves, Wells supported allowing freed blacks to vote, as well as disenfranchising ex-Confederates, not allowing them to vote. He scheduled a new constitutional convention for July 30th, 1866, to try and make this a state law. However, the convention was postponed because the New Orleans massacre occurred on that very day when armed Southern white Democrats attacked blacks who had a parade supporting the convention. The mayor of New Orleans had asked the local military commander to patrol the city and protect the convention and its supporters, but the U.S. Army failed to respond in time, and a group of white Democrats attacked the unarmed blacks, killing 34 black and 4 white people supporting them and wounding more than 40 others, with the majority of the wounded being blacks. It was during Reconstruction that federal troops were stationed throughout the South to pacify the region and protect elections. President Andrew Johnson blamed such events on Republican agitators, and the Freedmen's Bureau, along with the occupation armies, had been successful at preventing the implementation of the Southern Black Codes, which would limit the rights of blacks, but gave them the rights to work and choose where they wanted to live. This did not sit well with the white majority. The Reconstruction Act was passed on March 2, 1867, over President Johnson's veto, which required that black men be given their rights in southern states but not applicable in northern states. Also, southern states had to ratify the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship and equal rights to African Americans after the Civil War before their readmission into the Union, which was another major point of contention. President Johnson, a Democrat, prevented the Republican governor of Louisiana from using either the state militia or U.S. forces to suppress the insurgent groups, such as the Knights of the White Camellia, even after more violence against blacks occurred, to include burning the homes of blacks as well as white Republican supporters. In November 1868, the criminal activity reached a new level. William Smith Calhoun, a major plantation owner, inherited the property and slaves from his father, Meredith Calhoun. William Smith Calhoun, despite being a former slaveholder, lived with a mixed-race common-law wife, and he supported black freedoms and equality. He was a major organizer of the Black Republicans. Calhoun led a group of freed blacks to vote at a store owned by one John Huey, where the ballot box was located. Hoey openly threatened to publicly whip the blacks if they voted Republican. Calhoun had the ballot box moved to a plantation store owned by a fellow Republican, and 150 black votes were cast, with the Republicans receiving 318 votes and the Democrats only 49. In a rage, a group of white men stormed in and took the ballot box and threw it into the Red River. The white Democrats then arrested Calhoun, alleging election fraud, and with the original ballot box missing, Democrat Michael Ryan went on to claim a landslide victory. This election was also marked by violence, such as when Election Commissioner Hal Frazier, a black Republican, was murdered. As a result, Calhoun drafted a bill to create a new parish out of parts of Wynne and Rapides parishes, which passed the Republican legislature, and other new parishes were also created by the Republican state legislature to try and secure better political control. When Ulysses S. Grant became president in 1869, he hit back against the KKK hard and saw legislation passed securing blacks their rights. Needless to say, it was not a very popular decision. The Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871 that Grant signed into law prohibited people from congregating with the purpose of disrupting an election and gave the federal government the authority to use its troops in defense of blacks and their new constitutional rights. One of the greatest tensions was the right for blacks to own guns. Black men were elected to office, they organized militias, and they stood up for their civil liberties. But freedom has enemies, and they were sharpening their knives. In 1872, a contested election threw Louisiana into political chaos when the Republican candidate, William Pitt Kellogg, one of Louisiana's U.S. senators, was declared the winner as governor, but the Democrats, still loyal to the Confederacy in all but name, refused to accept it, and both sides declared victory. John McHenry, the Democrat candidate, had lost fairly, but the KKK was not about to let that election stand. The segregationist and Reconstructionist sides fought a legal battle as well as physical battles, sending armed men to occupy various government buildings. In March of 1873, pro-Reconstruction forces occupied the Grant Parish courthouse in Colfax. Stoking the flames, the Klan spread rumors throughout the community, playing on fears that the blacks would start a Nat Turner style of revolt and attack whites. And please see our video on Nat Turner. On April 8th, the anti-Republican Daily Picayune newspaper of New Orleans inflamed tensions and distorted events with the following headline: "The riot in Grant Parish. Fearful atrocities by the Negroes. No respect shown to the dead." This article brought even more whites to Grant Parish, all experienced Confederate veterans. They also brought a 4-pound cannon that could fire iron slugs. As the Klansman Dave Paul said, "Boys, this is a struggle for white supremacy." The black Republicans rightly feared an armed coup by the Klan and their Democrat supporters, so they had fortified the building, which was surrounded by cane fields and cypress trees. A few armed themselves, and the men dug trenches around the building, vowing to hold the line. Then, on Easter Sunday, April 13, 1873, the white militia came. The white militia was led by former Confederate officer Christopher Columbus Nash, and over 300 white men, many being Klansmen, and they surrounded the courthouse. The black defenders numbered around 150, and they held out for several hours. The two sides exchanged fire, but the roughly 60 defenders inside the courthouse surrendered after the white supremacist aimed a cannon at the building. The defenders displayed white flags for surrender, one made from a shirt, the other from a page of a book. The shooting stopped, but it was really just getting started. Reportedly in response to the accidental shooting of their leader by one of their own, the whites, growing tired of the standoff, then set the courthouse ablaze, and as the defenders fled, the white supremacist force began to execute captured and wounded members of the militia. As the blacks fled, many were unarmed and others were surrendering. They were hunted down and executed. Many were shot in the back. Many were shot in the head and neck. Dozens were taken prisoner. Many were lynched. Others, not shot, were beaten to death. The rest who escaped were tracked down and then murdered hours later. Many were shot after laying down their arms, and others were killed while trying to escape across the Red River, and they were chased on horseback. The horrors continued for the rest of the day and through the night, and only 3 white attackers had died. The whites then spread out into the town, indiscriminately murdering black residents of Colfax. By the time the Louisiana State Militia arrived the next day, April 14th, an estimated 150 people had been killed, but an exact count was made difficult by the hiding of many of the bodies. Over 150 black men were killed, and their bodies were dumped in a mass grave. Some were buried alive, and some were burned alive. Then the news reached federal authorities, and federal prosecutors tried to seek justice. Kellogg ordered the state militia under Colonels Theodore DeCline and William Wright to Colfax, with warrants to arrest 50 white men and to install a new compromised slate of parish officers. DeCline and Wright found the smoking ruins of the courthouse at Colfax and many bodies of men who had been shot in the back of the head or the neck. However, the exact number of dead was never really established, but 2 U.S. Marshals who visited the site on April 15th and buried dead reported 62 casualties. A military report to Congress in 1875 identified 81 black men by name who had been killed, and that between 15 and 20 bodies had been thrown into the Red River, with another 18 being secretly buried, for a grand total of at least 105. A state historical marker from 1950 noted fatalities as 3 whites and 150 blacks. Several of those arrested were convicted of crimes under the Enforcement Acts, but other more serious charges, such as murder, were brought against several white perpetrators under the Enforcement Acts, also known as the Ku Klux Klan Acts, laws which were designed to protect black civil rights. The U.S. Attorney, James Roswell Beckwith, in New Orleans, sent a telegram about the massacre to the U.S. Attorney General. The Colfax Massacre made the headlines of national newspapers in almost every major city in the country. A Republican federal judge in New Orleans ruled that the Republican majority legislature be seated despite the massacre and the best efforts of the Klan. What emerged was the established rule that protections of the 14th Amendment did not apply to persons acting individually, but only to the actions of state governments. Due to this ruling, the federal government could no longer enforce the Enforcement Act of 1870 to prosecute actions by paramilitary groups such as the White League, which had chapters forming across Louisiana beginning in 1874. Intimidation, murders, and voter suppression by such groups were instrumental to the Democratic Party regaining political control of the state legislature by the late 1870s, and it continued for almost a century afterward throughout the southern states and beyond. The case was known as U.S. versus Cruikshank, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court in an 1876 decision that changed the nation. The federal government, they ruled, has no authority to prosecute individuals for civil rights violations under the 14th Amendment unless the state failed to act. Under that ruling, the killers walked free and the federal government all but abandoned Reconstruction. The Colfax Massacre was the beginning of the end of freedoms for black Americans. This decision gutted federal enforcement of civil rights protections and essentially gave a green light for racial violence in the South. The legacy of the ruling against the perpetrators only emboldened the white vigilantes. In August 1874, Republican office holders in Coushatta, Red River Parish were thrown out, assassinating the 6 white Republicans before they could leave the state, and killing up to 15 blacks who witnessed the murders. Violence like this was used by white Democrats to intimidate Republican voters and elected office holders, used to gain control of the state legislature in the 1876 elections, and ultimately to end Reconstruction in Louisiana. Emboldened by the decision, the Ku Klux Klan rose again, and Jim Crow laws erupted all across the South. Voting rights were stripped. Lynchings became common. Blacks could not own guns. Some locations implemented sundown laws, meaning curfews, laws imposed stating that no blacks could be out after sundown or they would be arrested if they were lucky. These lasted until the late 1960s. The Colfax Massacre is believed to be the deadliest single incident of racial violence of the Reconstruction period, though it was by no means the only one. Faced with a still powerful segregationist force that was willing to use violence to hamper the work of Reconstruction, the project of enforcing racial equality in the South collapsed in the late 1870s and had been abandoned by 1880, leading to the Jim Crow era. Historian Eric Foner stated, Every election in Louisiana between 1868 and 1876 was marked by rampant violence and pervasive fraud. In 1920, a committee met in Colfax to purchase a monument to memorialize the 3 white men who had died. This monument stands in the Colfax Cemetery. In 1950, Louisiana erected a state highway marker which read that the event of 1873 was the Colfax Riot, as that was traditionally known in the white community. The marker states, "On this site occurred the Colfax Riot, in which 3 white men and 150 Negroes were slain. This event on April 13, 1873 marked the end of carpetbag misrule in the South." The marker was removed on May 15, 2021 and placed in a museum. And on April 13, 2023, the 150th anniversary of the Colfax Massacre, the old marker was replaced with the erection of a 7-foot granite monument that listed the 57 black people confirmed by name to have been killed in the massacre. The rest are still unknowns. Thank you for watching this episode of Forgotten History. If you liked what you saw, please click like, share, and subscribe. And if you would like to assist with the ever-increasing cost of production, please consider becoming a channel member and joining our Patreon page. Please check out our merchandise store. And thanks for watching.